So welcome. I did the introduction at the
Yeah.
beginning. So now the stage is yours.
Okay, so everyone can see my screen?
Yes.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you, Rahul. That was a beautiful lecture. I think the two lectures will work well together for the audience, but I don't know who the audience is, so it's all a little bit strange, but I will do my best to communicate some thoughts about the peri-urban. Let me begin with a quote from an old friend of mine. This is a quote from Richard Foreman, also at Harvard. Richard's a renowned landscape ecologist. And he writes, "You can have a small impact in a city centre, but if you want to have a big impact, go out to the dynamic urban edge where solutions really matter for both people and nature." And in my career over the last 15 years in particular, I've taken this to heart and pursued it as a research direction. And so the title of my lecture is Peri-urbanism. And I'm going to look at this topic of peri-urbanism from not just getting out to the periphery of centripetal cities, but I'll scale up from that to look at, we'll look at a range of different scales to eventually arrive at the problem of the planetary, because it seems to me that we are living in an age where it is demanded of us that we expand our sense of place from the local, not just to the global, but to the planetary, and try to connect a sense of where we are in terms of orientation, metaphysical and physical orientation, with the sort of hyper object of climate change and the Earth system. So we're living in a period where our imaginations are becoming increasingly stretched, and I find it very compelling and interesting and challenging. And I think this has ramifications for design culture. I'm going to also offer just a quick sketch of, it's not really a theory, but a sort of poetic, a couple of statements about the peri-urban. We will look at a suburban development, which is really about the practicality of trying to get design agency with suburbia, which has always been something of a designer-free zone. You know, designers don't usually engage with suburbia, but I did, in my career, I have tried to do that. I thought that was important. And I have the scars from those battles. Then I'll look at a whole of city scale. I'll look at even at a national scale in the case of the future of Australian cities, very briefly. And then I'll take you on a grand tour, as it were, of a whole range of cities across the world, which are cities, they are the largest and fastest growing cities in the world's richest biological regions. And then I'll end with a planetary sort of fantasy that I'm currently working on. Okay, so let's go. I would like to acknowledge the fact that the turn from the center of cities to the periphery is not just something that Richard Foreman advises, but also something that the recent event, the Roma 2025, it was a conceptual project gathering many universities from around the world. It was really an update of the Interrotta, okay? And I thought it was quite a clever idea for, 40 years or so after the original Interrotta, which looked at the center of Rome and the issue of heritage and urban fabric. This update to that focused on the peri-urban. So here, of course, I've just highlighted in the red square, you can see the Rome, old Rome, as many people know it. But the project here was to conceptualize the peri-urban larger territory, the city in relation to its region. And with my colleague, Valerio Morabito from Calabria, who comes over to Penn periodically to teach studios, we worked on, our fragment was or our piece of the grid was this unit that I've just highlighted in green, with all of the fiore, the ravines running through this territory. So it was really, I won't go into this project, but I thought I would show it to you, simply to say that if we think of the Interrotta, and then when we think of this event over the last 40 years, there has been a turn to the metabolism of urbanization with regard to larger territories. And that, of course, has played into landscape architecture's, disciplinary territory. And it's played into the discourse of landscape urbanism, of which I was a part. And so if the peri-urban is the transitional landscape par excellence, we don't really know what the peri-urban is. The peri-urban is kind of hard to define. And I'm going to show you a series of images now, and they'll start layering up upon one another. And there's a timeline down the left. So that first aerial photo was from 1950, 1960, 1970, 1980 now. And this is a piece of peri-urban territory outside of a city called Perth on the west coast of Australia. And one of my PhD students, Sarah Paget-Kiersgaard, has done hundreds of these mappings as part of her PhD. And I think they're quite beautiful, and they're quite useful in terms of trying to understand the peri-urban. As these images layer up upon one another, it's interesting to try and fix your eye on a certain part of the image and hold that part of the image and look at the changes that occur. Sort of mesmerizing. It's not just, the obvious, which is the complete colonization of these landscapes by rampant development in a fairly short period of time. But, in the case of Australia, this landscape runs very deep. This land has been occupied and managed by Indigenous people for 50,000 years before the British arrived, and falsely claimed that it was a terra nullius, a place without civilization, which was a legal fiction so as to absolve them of guilt and any legal complications in terms of taking over the country. But it's interesting the way in which the landscape, even when you get to the very end of the cycle and the whole thing has been developed, you can still see correlations through the palimpsest of the historical, how the fabric is layered up over time. And this is very much, of course, what landscape architects are concerned with whenever they deal with a particular project in a particular place. I mean, architecture has a much more acrobatic relationship to gravity than landscape. For us, the ground is kind of everything. Indeed, sometimes we exaggerate that. Nonetheless, against this background, I will begin a sketch of what I think that peri-urban is, and it begins like this. The peri-urban is neither urban, suburban, or rural. The peri-urban is, if you like, the bastard child of urbanism. It has no identity, it has no advocates, it has no theories, it has no aesthetics. It's ugly, submissive, it's vulnerable, it's sacrificial, it's accommodating, capacious, flexible, fast. The peri-urban is really whatever you want it to be. Since the Industrial Revolution, the peri-urban has always been in the process of losing its identity. The peri-urban is always disappearing, always becoming something else, leaving only the faintest traces and scar tissue of its former self. Now, to extend that a little bit into a more contemporary reading, I would say that now, in the mega regions of planetary urbanization, the peri-urban is no longer just peripheral territory. The idea of peripheral territory kind of only makes sense when you're dealing with single expanding cities, as if, cities expanding with growth rings outwards. But now with polycentric mega regional networks of cities, I think the peri-urban is something different. So it's not just transitional. This interstitial territory, what we used to call the peri-urban, is neither culture or nature. And therefore we could say that instead of it being simply transitional or transactional, the peri-urban is actually trans. It's not just ground for urbanism's figure, and it's not just dark matter for urbanism's bright lights. The peri-urban is living tissue. It's the cytoplasm on which the city depends for its sustenance. The peri-urban isn't just urbanism's whore, but something that now asserts itself as a novel ecology. And if we can appreciate it as such, it holds out the prospect of becoming a landscape of urbanism and an urbanism of landscape. So this is also personal for me in the sense that I grew up in a landscape very much like the image that you currently see on the screen, which is the Australian dream or the American dream of a suburban house and garden and a car. And this is a marvellous place for children to grow up. And what was most marvellous about it was that the new suburbs, as the city, this is Sydney where I grew up, and on the edge of the city was pushing up against old remnant farmland and remnant bushland. So it was pushing, the new suburbs were always pushing up against, and as I would later realise as I became an adult, completely destroy and erase the peri-urban as they proceeded to expand. So what was a landscape of innocence for a child becomes a kind of a landscape of shame and disregard for Indigenous culture and ecologies as an adult. And so I became interested in trying to deal with that condition in some way through design. So if we take the other view of of the mechanics of suburban development, it actually looks like this. It's more or less a military operation. And the logistics of this and the mechanics of this is something that designers, the design community has largely abandoned, except for, and left it. Architects have completely abandoned suburbia. Landscape architects still find some work in this territory, but it's largely decorative. And they've abandoned this territory and left it for the new urbanists, of course, who have dominated with a somewhat nostalgic and reactionary view of urbanism that I'm opposed to. And I might come back to that later on when we look at some other examples. But in any event, my interest was, well, how can design get involved in the landscape that you see on this image now? What do you do? And this is, so very, very briefly, I will sketch a project that offers some insights into that. But we have to gloss it. We don't have time to go into the detail. This project has been a 10-year battle, in fact. But I will just show you the conceptual outlines of it. So this is normally what happens. This sort of development has very low ecological performance and questionable sociological performance. It is utterly dominated by economics and developers. It's a sort of a design-free zone, and yet it's the most, marketable, desirable sort of commodity in the modern world. And so, how would you possibly redirect that sort of sprawl? And it seemed to me, at least, that if you examine the peri-urban, you can find fragments of things to work with that could help structure the development front as it comes through. I'm not saying that you can resist the growth of cities. I'm saying that you can redirect that growth to some extent. And so this project is on the outskirts of the city of Perth in Western Australia. What you see on that map is close to 2 million people living in the red coloured territory. It's one of the most sprawled cities on the planet. That map is almost 140 kilometres from top to bottom. The blue areas of land are projects being developed now. So you can see that those blue sites are building into the peri-urban, and the black areas are is classified as rural land that is not yet able to be developed, but will be. And this is a rapidly growing city. So this project is that you can just see it there. I've marked it with the arrow, this little yellow blob in there. That piece of land is actually 1,500 hectares and a project for 40,000 people. And here's the plan for that project. The sort of all of the organic territory that you can see through here is set back by us to protect drainage lines and protect remnant wetlands in here. So this is all buffering, and it creates an ecological kind of superstructure which become the bones of the project. And having set all of that land aside as kind of environmental buffer, all of this territory, all of this in-between territory, the grey zones, is what the developers can rightly, without causing too much ecological damage, develop. And so the project here was how can we structure all of that urbanisation for 40,000 people? Now, typically what happens is this up here to the right. You see the established suburbs. And there is a rule that when you do a project like this, you must set aside 10% of the developable area as public open space. And that gives you these little blobs of white, which are public parks, recreational spaces. And our argument here was, well, let's not do that. Let's not just put a little blob of public open space here and then let the developers do whatever they want around it. Let's try and structure it. So we took the 10% of the territory that we had as a rule and we stretched it long and thin to create these lines. And these lines represent avenues and drainage corridors, stormwater corridors, avenues of 4 rows of trees. And that would be essentially the bones of the project. And we were lucky with this client because they did come to us first. In other words, often landscape architecture comes afterwards. We were very lucky here that we got the whole site up front, and the client said to us, we want you to create a suburban development as if the landscape really mattered. So that led to securing all of this ecological territory, but it also led to trying to structure all of the grey developable territory. Now, of course, developers, particularly in suburbia, hate being told what to do. So that's why I say this has been a 10-year battle to try and achieve these lines which cross many, many different property boundaries and ownership. It's a mosaic of 35 different landowners. So to parcel this up and then develop it and to achieve these avenues and give suburbia a kind of landscape structure was very difficult. It was also a kind of water machine in the sense that this harvested all the storm water and filtered it before the water leaves the site and moves into the larger system. Now, having worked on, so that's the site there for that project that I just showed you. Now, I want to scale up a little bit and talk briefly about all of this dark area here, this land that is about to be zoned for development. And you can see just graphically by the scale of this city, this is a city that's population is doubling rapidly. So it's 1.9 million people, and it was predicted or is predicted to double the population in a matter of a couple of decades or so. And the city had no real plan for this. So I thought that was a very interesting research question. How should this city double its size in more or less the immediate future? And what worried me about it was that at the city's disposal is all of this black land. And you could see the city that is currently one of the most sprawled in the world could quite obviously replicate itself into all of this black old agricultural land. This is sort of degraded agricultural land. And the developers and the planners, they know this, and this is like the economic engine of the city, of course, is for the development front to push out into all of that black territory and build a city based on cars, based on fossil fuels. And to do that in the early 21st century seemed to me to be madness. And so the question was, well, how could we intervene in an established centralized planning and development culture with alternative images of the future for urban growth and try to develop images that could engage the public without lapsing into utopian visions, but also not being so banal that wouldn't capture anybody's interest. And the first thing we did was to develop a kind of green, this is classic landscape architectural approach, organize the landscape structure first And so what you see with this green plan, it's really a landscape structure plan for the whole city that achieves connectivity and for biodiversity, for flows, ecological flows, protects all the riparian corridors, protects aquifer recharge areas, and connects remnant patches of vegetation into a larger whole, which of course is always the problem because we're constantly dealing with the issue of fragmented habitat, which has low ecological value and is particularly problematic vis-a-vis climate change because species cannot move. They are effectively trapped in small protected areas, which unless they can migrate from those protected areas and be part of a larger ecological system, they will die. In any event, so this is also quite a powerful drawing to do for a city because it says to the developers and the government, okay, you can have the white territory. The white territory you see on that drawing is developable. There's no remnant habitat. There's minimal ecological damage if you build in that territory. Now, the problem there, of course, is that the existing city is here. If you do build in all that territory, you are sprawling the city. And so we wanted to take a position to get into the debate in the culture of this particular city. We didn't want to present as either pro or anti-sprawl. We wanted to just present alternative ways of growing a city. And we did a whole lot of infill development scenarios and a whole lot of, I guess you'd call them sprawl development scenarios, which I'll show you. I'll just show you the sprawl scenarios very briefly. Again, this was a 3-year project and it's a 450-page book, and I'm showing it to you in a matter of 4 or 5 slides. But, you know, this was called Boomtown 2050 Scenarios for a Rapidly Growing City. And what we did was we tried to, instead of being sort of avant-garde about it and pretending that urbanism is infinitely able to be reinvented, we went in the other direction and thought, you know, things like Ebenezer Howard's Garden City and even Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City, perhaps not Le Corbusier, but that's a different sort of vision. But some of these old models seem to me to be worth rereading, let's say. And so what you can see in this kind of image, again, these are very sort of intentionally dumb and fast images, but here's the green structure that I showed you. So that what you see here as green is this structure and plan. And then, of course, you could develop small pods of development for 50,000 people, small communities, small towns, but you could do that for 1.5 million people. And these small developments could be highly designed. And according to, you know, the original Garden City model was that these are townships or developments about 4 times the density of conventional suburbia. So you have a smaller footprint. That enables agricultural land to exist around these developments, but also it allows you to build this larger green superstructure. You could relate the same problem of rapid urbanisation and population growth to energy. So this scenario was all about how we could live with energy production. This scenario talked about food production and tried to find a sweet spot in terms of the relationship between density and the amount of territory you need at your doorstep in terms of food production. Not all food production, but a lot of our food could be produced within an urban territory with nutrient exchange between the urbanism and the landscape. And this was worked out according to those metrics. So what you see here, the level of density, these are in this grey area is enough. This amount of land is enough to feed the people that you see in the density surrounding those areas. And then there could be a transport system threaded through this urbanisation, which, again, the density is enough to sustain a transport system that would reduce our reliance on cars. And then the issue of employment and industrial production is also factored in. So you can see in all of these drawings, admittedly fairly crude, is an attempt to weave together the logistics of urbanisation with landscape systems, both productive landscapes and pre-existing landscapes of habitat and the hydrological system and so on. Now, to put those 3 things together in a way that could be buildable, let's say, as I said earlier, not necessarily utopian. And all of this was done in a way that was not to pretend that we had the answer, but to open up different scenarios for the city to open a conversation up about how it should grow, which is really a conversation about how a city should treat its peri-urban territory. And then that piece of work expanded to a national scale because the nation, which is Australia, is currently a population of some 23, 24 million people, but that population is expected to triple by the end of the century. And again, there's no plan for that. But it is a planned economy, and it does have Australia has a good planning system. And so this piece of research, in this case, I'm showing you, this is a book, but just a few slides. Our argument was that if infrastructure was provided down the east coast and down the west coast, these areas, after a landscape analysis of the entire continent, these areas seemed like the best areas for population to be concentrated, and the government could encourage that concentration through the development of high-speed rail down either coastline, which would encourage the development of mega regions. In other words, mega regions by design. Typically, mega regions occur organically and naturally by themselves. It's just the growth of urbanization over time. But our argument here was that as the existing cities get bigger and bigger and bigger, they become unworkable. Australian cities are almost at breaking point. All of our major cities are up around 5-6 million people now, and they're breaking. They're not working. So as cities approach megacity status, which by definition is 10 million people or more, their livability, the quality of life in those cities tends to decline. So our argument was to try and develop a model of decentralization and encourage the development of new cities with smaller populations of 1 or 2 million people linked together by high-speed rail would be a smarter way of dealing with the imminent population growth in this nation over the course of the 21st century. And then again, you get the problem of representation. How do you represent such a thing in a way that is not utopian, but not so banal as to be uninteresting? And so there's a fine line there, which I think these images start to suggest. So the red line is, of course, the high-speed rail. And again, you can see there's a sense of symbiosis or integration between urban form and landscape systems. At least that's the intent. Here in this example, the city has been pulled back from the coast in anticipation of sea level rise related to agricultural production, and then there's the high-speed rail moving through. So that we've just been here in terms of our global location, looking at the city of Perth. And the city of Perth sits within what we call a biological hotspot. Biological hotspots are recognised by the international scientific and conservation community as 35 regions around the world where the genetic diversity in those regions is endemic and unique, and it is also threatened with extinction. So behind the little dots of yellow light that you can see on this map, the green areas are those biological hotspots. That means that if we lose species in those territories, you cannot get them anywhere else. That's it. So the hotspots are to planetary ecology what libraries are to culture, right? I mean, these are the storehouses of life's creative potential and capacity thus far. So anyway, I've done a lot of work at Penn over the last 7 years, and the Atlas for the End of the World was a big project to conduct an audit of those biological hotspots. And by audit, I mean we looked at land use in those green territories that you see on this map to see how they were performing vis-a-vis United Nations targets to which all of these nations are signatory. That is to say that, well, the target is that from the Convention on Biological Diversity, was that the nations of the world would reach a 17% target of protected area, which is a very ambitious target. It's effectively 1/5 of the world's terrestrial area would be set aside as protected area. And I'll come back to that in a moment because that's a very important number. But anyway, so the audit, the atlas that we did, which was about land use and policy settings, was a piece of work. But what I'm showing you with this drawing is a second phase of that, where we're looking not at land use, but we're looking at the behaviour of the cities in these biologically rich territories. And every yellow dot that you see on this map is a city that is using the United Nations definition of cities, and this goes back to Rahul's point about data and definitions. These are all somewhat academic and highly questionable, but nonetheless, for the purposes of the research, we said, well, we'll adopt the United Nations definition of a city, which is 300,000 people or more, and we will examine what's happening with these cities in the world's most biologically rich regions. And every yellow dot you see here indicates that the city is rapidly growing in direct conflict with endangered species. That means the peri-urban territory of each and every yellow dot you see on that map is a territory of conflict, direct conflict between urban growth patterns and endangered species. By endangered species, I mean species that are on the IUCN Red List as threatened. Now, so that's a frightening map. What this map tells us at a planetary scale is that urbanisation is, it illustrates the violence of urbanisation in terms of biodiversity. And we all know cities are destructive and violent, brutal, in fact. But it does raise the question, well, can we do anything about it? And at the moment, the international design and planning community is doing very little about it, because most design intelligence is so entangled with neoliberal capital, which tends to be in city centres, not out on the peri-urban, where, as I began the lecture, Richard Foreman advised we go to. In other words, Richard was asking us to get out there and try and deal with this kind of problem. And so that's driven my research. To make this more manageable, we've reduced the set. We looked at, this is 463 cities that you see here. Over 90% of the cities in the world's biological hotspots are expanding in conflict with endangered species. To make that more manageable, we reduced the sample set down to 33, and we are now working with these 33 cities and conducting case studies in different particular cities. And in a moment, I'll take you to one example of that in Bogota, the capital of Colombia. Here they are, what we're calling the Hotspot Cities project. And the idea is these cities all share a certain condition. They're all effectively, they're sitting in the world's richest biological landscapes, and they have the opportunity to become stewards of those landscapes and champion the notion of urban growth not just being a destructive fait accompli, but something that can be directed to an extent. And of course, the overarching aim here and aspiration is that, and there's nothing new in this. This is a relatively, it's an old idea, in fact, but that there could somehow be a reconciliation between urbanism and landscape. And my view of that is that that's an inventive project and a project that can be conducted by design. Whereas the new urbanists, I would say, represent a school of thought that argue that the city is effectively finished. I mean, for them, the city finishes in the 19th century. And there is no possibility. In fact, Andres Duaney argues explicitly that there can be no landscape urbanism. There can be no urbanism of landscape, because landscape and urbanism are mutually incompatible. Ecological systems and urban grids just don't fit together. And so I would dispute that. In any event, we're going to do our grand tour now, and I'll quickly take you around the world. We'll have a quick look at each of these cities. The maps that we've done of them. So here's the first, Auckland in New Zealand. We'll work our way from the east to the west. Each time you look at one of these maps, I want you to appreciate that the red area that you are seeing on them indicates conflict zones between endangered species and forecasted urban growth to 2050. Now, the data set for this is taken from Karen Sito's work at Yale, the Sito lab at Yale. Karen is extremely good at mapping urbanisation on a global scale, and has a fairly reliable method of predicting where cities will grow. And then what we've done is we've taken her data set and we've superimposed that on the ranges of endangered species and the areas of remnant habitat. And when you put those data sets together, you get zones of imminent conflict. So in this case, what you hear is the city of this white area represents existing the urban footprint of the city. The red area represents conflict between urban growth out to 2050, where there are endangered species and remnant habitat. These little hatched areas represent protected areas. So this is marine protected, terrestrial protected. So in a sense, what you don't want to see is red. And as you'll notice, all these maps are kind of screaming red at us. And then I'll offer you just a snapshot of the different peri-urban conditions. So that's the outskirts of Auckland. This is Perth, where we've just been looking. That suburban project I showed you was down in here somewhere. So you can see what's happening here with the population rapidly growing up against remnant habitat. It's a bloodbath. We'll have to move quickly, but it would be nice to dwell on these images because they show you variations on a global peri-urban condition that largely goes under the radar. As I said at the outset, there's no theory of these territories. There's no aesthetics of these territories, and yet they are incredibly interesting and volatile. And as Richard said, it's where sort of everything is happening. This is Sydney, again, rapidly expanding. Sydney is interesting because you see it's surrounded by national parks, so a lot of protected area. But the population is pushing hard up against those territories. This is the edge of Sydney. Colombo, Sri Lanka, same phenomenon. It's more or less the same phenomenon in all of these cities, of course. That's the set. That's why we're studying them. Davao, the Philippines. Jakarta, poor old Jakarta. I mean, really, but not so much here. This Jakarta's sinking, in fact. Makassar, Indonesia. The Pearl River Delta, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou. Osaka. So just to remind you, these are all the largest and fastest growing cities in the biological hotspots. So what we call hotspot capitals. So instead of them being sort of capital cities of nations, our argument is that it could be productive, rhetorically at least, to reposition these cities as capitals of their hotspots, as if to say they should take greater responsibility for the biological inheritance that they have, the rich biology that's on their doorsteps. Chengdu, China. Rawalpindi, Pakistan. As you see on the maps, the name of the city, but then after the name of the city, after the city, the nation, and then the name of the hotspot. Tashkent, Uzbekistan, the mountains of Central Asia is the hotspot. Baku, Azerbaijan. Isfahan, Iran, the Irano-Anatolian Plateau. All of this is unregulated development. Tel Aviv, massive predicted growth there by 2050. Mecca, Saudi Arabia. Dar es Salaam, we've now moved down, so we've moved across Central Asia, we're coming down into Africa. Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Nairobi, Kenya. Lagos, of course. And so it goes. Durban, South Africa. Cape Town, South Africa. And then we come up into North America, and I'll just run down from North America down into the South and Central America. This is Los Angeles. You can see all of the peri-urban growth there, predicted out to 2050, again, directly up against habitat. Houston. Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Down into Mexico, Mexico City. Guadalajara, Mexico. And so on, Sao Paulo. Guayaquil, Ecuador. Look at this. Santiago, Chile. Brasilia. So Bogota, which brings us to the end of that world tour. And you can see the condition is ubiquitous. And as I said, the question for us is then, well, what can design and planning do about this? And so we've been running case studies using different methods. We're trying to develop methods that suit different cities. In the case of Bogota, which is the capital of Colombia, Bogota was chosen as a case study by us because it has, as Raul was talking about so well, Bogota has a really interesting combination of it's a planned city, but it's also an unplanned city. So it's sort of radically self-organized in terms of the construction of the favelas, the informal sector, but it's also a planned city. And so that it seemed to us, because it has the combination of those two forms of urbanization, it would be a useful case study. But also Colombia is the third most biodiverse nation in the world. So we've conducted a case study here. What you see here is Bogota pushing up against the topography, but the real problem for Bogota is it's actually growing into its own food bowl. So here is the existing city of Bogota outlined in red. Now that's 10 million people. That's the official number, but who really knows? Much of Bogota is informal settlement on the peripheries of the city and where the topography is steep. So that image we saw a minute ago is where this city is pushing up against this protected area and this topography. What's called the Sabana de Bogota is this region. Everything inside that dashed line is really the food bowl of the city, incredibly rich land that produces a lot of food. And so the city, and this is the Rio Bogota here, the legal boundary of the city. The city is leapfrogging that riparian corridor through the middle and sprawling into the food bowl here in an unregulated manner. The city is about to build a second airport out here. And a lot of this territory is also, you get a lot of sprawl in here for the flower industry. All the flowers here are grown, trucked to the airports and flown up to America. And it's a weird kind of ecology. But the city has grown as far as it can in terms of its legal limits. So it's now sprawling in an ad hoc manner into its food bowl. So the question and the method here became, can we produce a plan for Bogota that would synthesize the inevitable rapid urban growth of the city and the landscape's biological structure? Could we effectively create a landscape structure plan that absorbed the future growth and worked in symbiosis with the future growth, but not just for the planned economy, but also for the informal sector? This project was done with a colleague of mine, David Governor, who is an authority in terms of South and Central American informal urban growth. To cut a long story very short for you, the first thing we did, as good landscape architects, we've tried to connect the dots. In other words, where you have fragments of remnant habitat, we've connected those into a larger system so that the gene pool, the biology of the place can flow, so species can move, so water can be protected, the wetlands can be protected. And that provides you with the essential armature, the body, as I said in the very beginning, the cytoplasm for the city. Now, it's that kind of structure, and you can just see by its form, this is a kind of idealized landscape pattern of what we call landscape connectivity. Now, it is, to the new urbanist's point, it is somewhat antithetical to what you would typically call good urbanism. Like, it makes urbanism difficult. It makes urbanism somewhat illegible in a traditional sense. And yet our argument is that we have to endeavour to synthesize these systems. We have to strive to create the ecological city. There is no future for urbanism unless there's no future for the city unless it becomes ecological. In any event, so this project is really, top down. We're coming at this from 50,000 feet in the air. Although we have very good contacts on the ground and we spend a lot of time there, we sort of know what we're doing, but it's very much a planning project, because our conclusion was that that's what Bogota needed. Bogota does not have a plan for its 2050 growth projections, and so we thought this would be a useful polemical device to produce out of the studios at Penn. So first is the ecological structure, and then secondary to that, we can work back into that with the urban structure, and that is created by a major transport loop that connects the existing city to all this new urban growth. There's the second airport that will activate a whole lot of industry. We can pack the flower industry around that airport. There are no development zones because of the air rights for the two airports. That's the new airport. This is the existing airport of Bogota. We can protect all that land through there, which is the Rio Bogota, the river. All of these wetlands can be protected, and then we can forge connectivity, landscape connectivity woven through the urban fabric. There's much more work in this than we have time for, but I want to so there's the synthesis. And, it's debatable whether this does this a good city make? So that's 10 million people here now. And this is what we're saying. That could be the future of Bogota. It also protects a lot of the agricultural land, but yes, it develops a lot of the agricultural land too. I mean, you have no choice to some extent. What we also do is there's a massive area in here, this kind of green heart. The whole city is wrapped around a sort of a new idea of an ecological central park that celebrates the biodiversity of this extraordinary landscape. I can blow that up a little bit for you there. You see it there. It's a little bit out of focus. But there's Central Park scaled to that, so you get a sense of what's going on here. Now, there's a whole lot of, also in terms of the urbanism itself, there's a whole lot of zoning in here that we've done where we're saying that the informal sector has to be factored in. It has to be, the infrastructure has to be provided. It's not that we're saying we should gather up the informal city and pack people into government housing, but rather the informal city has many, as Rahul, I think, illustrated, has many virtues, and it should be encouraged and facilitated rather than excluded and ignored and sort of pretended it doesn't exist. Okay, so I'll finish with this project now, which brings us to the planetary. And I wasn't going to include this in the presentation, but in speaking with the organisers, they thought it was worth touching on. I mean, it's often said that one of America's greatest ideas, if not its greatest idea, was the idea of national parks. And you can see an advertisement for Yosemite National Park, which was created in the late 19th century for a whole range of aesthetic reasons. And national parks are, so if a national park was sort of a great idea in the 19th century, the research question here is, well, what would we do now for a global culture? And what could you do in terms of a landscape of conservation at a planetary scale? And what would the differences be between what you would do now and what that was? Because bear in mind, Yosemite was based on the exclusion of Indigenous people, the eviction of Indigenous people. It's a very white vision of landscape, and it's set up a binary between wilderness and urbanisation that is no longer tenable. So we've been working with, I'll come to it in a moment, but well, the World Park Project is the title of this project, and I've worried a lot about World Park. I don't really like the word world, and I don't really like the word park, but it's been very hard to find a simple sort of tagline for this piece of work that people can understand quickly. But the idea is not that this park would exclude people, but rather it would involve them. It would incorporate people into a much messier sort of idea of park. That it's more like the peri-urban is no longer the exception. The peri-urban is now the state of the planet. this interwoven condition between a denatured interweaving of culture and nature, there is no more wilderness. There's just ubiquitous novel ecologies and ubiquitous kind of peri-urban conditions in a way. And much of that territory needs to be restored. So the other idea of a world park is that it's part of a labour market. It's part of encouraging people to not just look at landscapes as aesthetic. It's not about landscape as view, it's about landscape as process, about building something, reconstructing landscapes. Now, to get to that, this is the current state of the world. This is a doctored Photoshop image of the planet. You can just make, this is Africa here, you can just make out the outline of Africa there. What we've done on this image is delete all of the territory that is not protected in the world. Now, this is an extraordinary image because what this image shows you is all of the territories that the conservation community has achieved in securing as protected area since about the 1960s, right? The IUCN was formed in 48, I think it was. So the latter half of the 20th century has seen this phenomenon whereby the scientific community and the conservation community has worked together to secure these bits of land. But you've got to ask yourself, what's wrong with this image? Now, from a biological perspective and a conservation perspective, what is wrong with this image is that it's an archipelago. It's a series of fragments. And as I said before, if species trapped in any of these fragments, if they can't migrate out and adjust to climate change, then they're history. So the central policy of the international conservation movement is connectivity. The policy to which 196 nations are signatory is that we will try to achieve connectivity between the fragments. What that really means is we're going to try and reshape land use on a planetary scale if we take it seriously. Not only that, the target was to get to 17% of the protected global terrestrial area as protected territory. And we are currently at 15.4%. So 15.4% of the world's terrestrial area is protected. And that's what you see on this image of the world. So you think to yourself, oh, okay, we've got 15.4% protected. That's a huge achievement. It's a problem because it's all in fragments. And we're trying to get to 17%. That's what everyone's agreed to do. We only need 1.6% more. So you could say, well, let's just get 1.6% of the world's terrestrial area in Siberia and in a big forest and lock it up, and we can say we're done. We can all go home. You cannot do that because the small print of the Convention of Biological Diversity stipulates that the land must be representative. It must represent the biological diversity of life on Earth, which means you must protect 17% of each eco-region, of which there are over 850. So that's the interesting, this is fascinating in terms of, this is the contemporary conservation landscape, which is extremely political and of course has economic implications. Now that 1.4% that we need to meet the target, you think it's not much. Well, this is what it is. It's actually close to 700,000 central parks. Right? So that's a lot of territory. If you put those central parks end to end, they would wrap around the planet 70 times. So there's your connectivity. So the research we've been doing is to ask, well, let's take that where should that 1.6% of territory be? And the problem with the conservation movement is that everything tends to happen in an opportunistic and ad hoc manner. And our argument has been that it could be coordinated. And the way to coordinate it is to capture it gather it up into the idea of a world park. So here are the world's biological hotspots. As I've said, the green areas are where we've met the target of 17%. The red areas are where we are a long way from meeting the target of 17%. And our argument has been, if you're going to secure more land to meet the target, we should do it as a priority in the world's richest biological territories. How do you do that from a design perspective? You need a catalyst. How do you shift the conservation landscape from a science, kind of epic science project, to a tangible design project so that all of the resources of the global conservation movement and the investment that's involved can be managed in a coordinated manner. And that's the rationale of the World Park. Now, if you just draw a line, what the idea here is to try and connect the world's hotspots into a complete system. And you can't, because it's too fragmented, but you can get many of them together. So that line there does connect a lot of the world's hotspots, as you can see. This line brings in another series, and that line brings in another series. Now, there's a few that are outstanding, but the idea here is that you could start with something that's a catalyst, very simple. And the idea is walking trails. These are like contemporary pilgrimage trails. I mean, hiking trails, recreational trails. So it's a very simple piece of infrastructure. But the idea is to, and in fact, much of it exists. There are many of where we've drawn these lines, many of those landscapes do have trails already existing. But to connect them up as a system related to the hotspots starts to open up the question of, or open up the possibility of attracting people into these regions and attracting investment. And the idea is the trails would become catalysts for landscape restoration projects, and around the corridors of the trails the trails could become landscape corridors connecting existing protected areas. So these trails, there are 3 of them. They connect 19 hotspots. They involve 55 nations, and they can amalgamate over 160,000 kilometres of restored habitat. You can see here how it works. It's very simple. The yellow areas on this map this is just an example. These are protected areas right now, but they're all fragmented. So the World Park does this work of creating a trail that connects them, and then the buffer that is, these are the hatched area is landscape restoration projects around the trail, which does the work of binding the protected areas into one sort of meta system. And that, as I've said, is crucially important for species migration. But it's also a radically human landscape. This all has to be built. All these areas, all of the landscapes in between the protected areas are almost invariably degraded. And so the project here is to catalyse the ecological restoration of these zones, involving local Indigenous communities and farmers and everyone. So here it is. We have actually mapped this territory. I've got thousands of maps at a scale now, which I won't show you, but here at this scale you can see this is the Pataska, which the name of the trail is the Pataska because it goes from Patagonia to Alaska, right down from North America down to South America. So putting those maps together at a slightly different scale. The Ozrock goes from the east coast of Australia through that biological hotspot right up through Central Asia and across to Morocco. 38,000 kilometres. This would take you 2 or 3 years to walk. And then the Taribia, which runs from Namibia around through the west coast of Africa up into the Irano Plateau, or Turkey. And there's that image. So, yeah, that's all I've got for you. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that wasn't too long, and I hope it wasn't boring, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.